Right, good evening, everybody, and
Mhm.
Happy New Year. Welcome to the first Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission meeting of 2023. So just to remind you all that this is a formal meeting of Hackney Council and all the usual constitutional requirements of council meetings apply. Can I remind members and officers that this meeting is being held in public and is being broadcast live via the internet? The rights of the press and public to record and film the meeting apply, and everyone present should note that media representatives may be in attendance or viewing the live stream. So moving on to item 1, apologies for absence. I've got apologies from Councillor Sizer, Councillor Turbot-Deloff, also got apologies from Paul Senior, the Director of Education and Inclusion. Connecting virtually, I think we have Councillor Charlton and Councillor Suso Runga. Richard Brown and Salma also. Okay, so now moving on to item 2. There are no urgent items and the order of business is as published. Item 3, declarations of interest. Do members have any declarations of interest?
No declarations of interest.
Trust Governor at Hackney New Primary School.
Thank you very much. And now moving on to our first substantive item for the meeting, which is item 4, the City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership Annual Report. So the City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership Annual Report is a standing item within the Commission's agenda, so as to allow the Commission to have oversight of child safeguarding work taking place across the borough. The annual report is at page 13 of the agenda pack and details of the work of the Safeguarding Partnership for the period April 2021 to March 22. It includes assessments of safeguarding and learning across all of those services which work with children in Hackney, including outcomes of safeguarding practice reviews. For this item, I have Jim Gamble, the Independent Chair of the City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership. Will Rory be joining you, or will it just be you? Oh, sorry, you're online, sorry, Rory. So we've got 45 minutes for this item. So for the first 5 minutes or so, can I just ask Jim to introduce the item and to briefly highlight key issues from the report, and then we can have the remaining time for questions and answers. And can I just also ask that that you don't spend any time on this item on unregistered settings, and we'll deal with that when we get to item 5 on unregistered settings, if that's okay with you. Handing over to you, Jim. Thank you.
I was pressing the green one. So thank you, Chair. And I mean, this report deals with what was in essence an extremely challenging year. I think we were just beginning to come back to some form of new normal. So what I've tried to do in the report is, first of all, acknowledge the good work done by our safeguarding partners across the board, by our lead members and by our officers and others, and actually their families. I think it was a particularly difficult time, and whilst those in the front line of safeguarding across the partnership were working hard to keep people safe, I know from talking to some of them that many of their own families were concerned and worried. So I wanted to highlight that. I also wanted to mark the fact that Anne Canning has moved on from the last time, and number one, to record my thanks in the annual report for her. She was a considered leader who did everything I think that she could at that time for Hackney, and also I've recognised the changes in leadership with Jackie Burke, who's now taken over, who has not missed a step in accelerating our journey and improving in lots of places that we can talk about later, and of course the new chief executive. The report speaks for itself. We've tried to make it as accessible as we normally do. We will issue a 10-minute video version of it later on next week, so that it becomes more easily accessible in some of the key highlights. But some of the highlights, I think, are the cyber attack. There's been good progress in respect of the recovery. Saw some good practical workarounds with partners working together, not least the council, health colleagues using CPIS, and also early help. I think the application of consistent practice standards for the council's targeted early help has borne fruit. We've trained up our first cohort of graded care profile 2 trainers, which is a system we're using to make it easier to assess neglect and focus on improving the consistency of how we engage and evaluate progress in those cases. There were over 16,000 young people, 16,672, accessing universal services offered by Young Hackney. That's 107% increase post-pandemic and lockdown periods. And work's ongoing with the delivery plan for the Children and Families Hub. I think that plays into what we're doing in MASH. There's been a lot of good work has gone on in MASH. As you know, we reviewed and moved away from FAST. I think, certainly from my perspective, that is showing real progress. Whilst we had over 12,000 contacts, 3,559 referrals, our re-referrals decreased by 17%, and our Section 47 investigations are broadly the same. And we're continuing to explore ways of making the system for multi-agency partners work better, so the daily briefing, introducing that, and of course the early help hub within to our MASH system and the consultation line. Around violence against women and girls, there's been an increase in MARACs, 694, and around half of the cases involve children. I think one of the areas where the partnership has worked particularly well, and we've been on a learning curve for a number of years, is around safeguarding adolescents. And if you read the detail in the report, perhaps what it won't expose is the fact that we moved, as others did, looking independently, first of all, at child sexual abuse, peer-on-peer abuse, missing from education. But I think as we've made progress, and I think that's reflected in the LGA peer review that Jackie commissioned, we've begun to look much more holistically at those pathways to harm and those driving factors that lead to adolescents engaging in pathways to harm. So there's good work being done there. I think the engagement with Red Thread, a charity that's working in emergency departments with adolescents, and we're beginning to see positive impact around that. But I think if you look at some of the case review work that we've done around to Sean Aird, around another range of children who we refer to by a letter of the alphabet as opposed to their name, we're moving to a space where we're really going to concentrate this year on lifting that work around safeguarding adolescents into a broader piece to better understand how alienation and isolation from statutory agencies can be a driving influence when it comes to young people getting into pathways to harm, and indeed finding themselves the victims or perpetrators of serious youth violence. And that's informed again by some of the work we've done around Child Q, looking at those factors around alienation and the negative impact. Elective home education has increased during the pandemic, but numbers have fallen steadily as we've begun to move back towards pre-pandemic levels. Children missing education, the last count was about 1,000, the majority from the Haredi community, so I'll not go into that further now. Private fostering, we continue to work hard in that. We have good figures around our app, but actually being able to identify those individuals within the local authority who are, in essence, private fostering remains a challenge. There's a range of issues around LADO that I could touch on. I'll not touch on them all, but what I will say is we're making progress with the police, whom we have challenged about their lack of engagement with LADO. All of the other partners engage when they have a scenario where someone who is working with children is involved in potential conduct that would make them unsuitable for that. Where we've had an issue has been getting the police to comply with that, because they tend to default to their own professional standards. But we have now engaged with the local commander, and he is reviewing issue, because we really think it's important that we have line of sight to any police officer who's being investigated or where there's a suspicion that they may be involved in conduct or behaviours that mean they should not be engaging with children. The reviews are included within the report. There are a number of particular interest, not least Child Q. What I would say about that at this stage is I'm in the final stages of the update report for the Mayor. I've just come from a meeting tonight with about 25 young people from Hackney, and that's a culmination of a rolling programme. And I will, I could say a little later on if you want about it, but we are heading towards the final update report being shared. The priorities and pledge, we included anti-racism as a key principle. You'll see within the report, the annual review, that I've made clear the fact that there is an issue with racism. It's no good hiding behind that. I think we couldn't stand behind the Child Q report and then dilute what we say about one of the most significant problems that we face. And we've worked with partners and our statutory leads in particular around looking at an active anti-racist strategy. So what I've tried to highlight in the report is that it's easy to say I'm anti-racist. It's harder to prove it. And what we are committed to as a partnership is where people say that they're anti-racist, establishing proof of that. So what challenges have they made? What investigations do they have that are ongoing? And what outcomes are accrued from that? That's how we will measure active anti-racism. Training is covered in the report, and we've included a draft outline of a new strategic safeguarding threat assessment that as we move forward will give members, not least lead members, an active insight into the issues that we see around the health and well-being of our workforce, the safeguarding themes that are emerging in the here and now, so that we can address them in a more timely fashion, and anything that links to interoperability difficulties engaging with others in the workforce. And I think that gives you a pretty good overview of everything that is in the report. And Jackie is here because often when I present this report, I take the credit because I get to speak for the work done by others. But there has been great work done, and we are, heading in a positive trajectory. I don't want to tempt fate, but with some really good people. Diane has done some really good work at a staff level around morale and addressing some issues that really needed to be. And I can only say what I've said in the report, that we have managed to transition what I thought was a high-risk leadership vacuum as we moved at pace with focus and in a way where I don't think we've lost a beat. In fact, we've accelerated. So I'll pause there. I'll just ask, with your permission, Chair, Rory, if I've missed anything that he wants to add.
Sure, Rory, if you want to come in.
Yeah, nothing to add from my perspective. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you very much. Before I go, thank you for the report, Jim, as ever. And before I go on to the Commission for some questions, I wanted to ask some questions about the cost of living crisis. We know to what extent this is impacting our children and families in the borough, but I suppose we're wanting to understand what that means in a sort of safeguarding context. And just wondering if you know if the Safeguarding Partnership has undertaken any assessment as to the likely impact or implications for local services. Do we have any assurances, or do you feel that you have any assurances from services that they've made adequate preparations in terms of service planning and service capacity to meet any increased variation in need? And are we confident that there is a multi-agency preventative early help, I know that you've mentioned that earlier, offer to address emerging safeguarding needs?
So we remain concerned about the cost of living crisis. I think evidence that it's manifesting itself on a significant scale is yet to be found. What I would say is we've held a number of extraordinary meetings where we've had all of the partners around the table. They have shared with us their contingency plans. For example, the fire service and how they're looking at how they can utilise their premises and their kitchen to support people right the way through to housing and other partners. So we're reassured that we have contingencies in place. I think what, you know, for many people, of course, this will be biting early, and I'd be happy for one of my colleagues to cut in. But what we've seen so far, certainly in our last meeting, is that we are prepared. We're prepared for worst case scenario. There are contingencies in place, but we've not yet moved to over the edge of the cliff. And I think that's how partners reflected it to me. But I'd be happy to share with you the feedback that we had from partners, because we did it as a structured mechanism to capture all of the contingencies that each of the partners has in place.
Rory, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just to add something to that, Chair, at our next board meetings, we're continuing our theme of looking at the cost of living crisis, but how it's manifesting and impacting on our frontline staff. So again, kind of recognising the health, stability and well-being of our workforce as being our key asset in terms of safeguarding children. We're wanting to test the water with partners about how this is affecting their ability to practice. So that's something that will build on the work that Jim's already just explained.
Thank you very much. And now over to the Commission for questions. Do you mind taking a couple at a time, Jim? Pen and paper to the ready. Councillor Billy Lubbock.
Yeah, so my first question touches on what you were saying about the police engagement with the LADO. I'm wondering, with regards to that, the Police and Probation Service had a 0% attendance in this list at the Hackney board, and I'm wondering if that's improved since March. And sort of looking more broadly, you know, obviously as part of the anti-racism practice, we had the child queue sequence of events. We've, you know, just today seen about David Carrick, and I'm wondering if there's any assurances that we're going to get more engagement from the police going forward.
I'll leave you with those for now.
Okay, so I'll take those three. Police engagement with the LADO. We are making progress on that, and we are concerned, but this is not something unique to Hackney. And we are working pan-London to see what can be done on this, and indeed outside. But it is an anomaly that's always existed. We're never going to be in a better position to press to have that reconciled than we are now. And I think we are as content as we could be that we're making progress on that. On the police and probation attendance, I think police attendance during the reporting year was not good at the boards. There's no excuse for that, because we were meeting virtually. I did address it with the borough commander, both verbally and in writing, and there has been a pickup since, but it simply is not good enough, and we've reflected that. I could say the same about probation, but I'd need to mitigate that. Probation have been through a number of central government inspired reviews and reorganisations, to the point that it's been almost musical chairs with regards to their leadership, their cohort, and their operating model has changed at least 3 times. And in essence, they've now moved back to a combined delivery. So it would be unfair to classify them in the same way as I have the police on that, but both have re-engaged much more positively since March. On police engagement and accountability from that, I have a meeting with the Deputy Assistant Commissioner at New Scotland Yard tomorrow to address some of the broader concerns, and indeed the progress or otherwise that they're making around some of the recommendations and action plans that we've shared with them.
Very much. I had said actually before that I was going to try and theme the questions a bit, because it just makes it a bit easier, just in case we sort of start moving between different topics. So does anybody have any questions on the safeguarding partnerships priorities for 2021-22? If not, I'll ask a question about what your priorities are for the current year, and what have been the most challenging to achieve practical positive impact.
Well, we've added to our priorities the active anti-racism. I think from our point of view, establishing a safeguarding first philosophy is key. Ensuring that our children are seen, heard and helped is critical. And of course, we're following the priorities that we have set year on year from a continuity point of view, and not least where we recognized a number of years ago that we needed to get back to basics. So our audit program is looking at that. The work we're doing around neglect is also committed to looking at that. And I think we have a strong partnership. We have good statutory leads. We have embraced the back to basics principle, and we've embraced challenge. So I am optimistic moving forward. I think embracing and policing the active anti-racism is going to be key for us.
Thank you, Jim. Now, does anybody have any questions on workforce? I don't want to end up being the only person asking these questions now.
Yeah, I'm pleased to hear, obviously, that the anti-racism is a priority for you across the partnership. I mean, what challenges do you foresee really across the different branches of the partnership? I think particularly in relation to the police, in ensuring a consistent systemic approach.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we talk across the partnership, first of all, I think being anti-racist is easy. Everybody will say it. It is rhetoric. I think recognizing and acknowledging that racism exists within your organization is the first test. The police struggled with that in Child Q. And in a number of meetings we had, senior officers whom I engaged willingly accepted the potential for adultification, but not racism. And ultimately, of course, we pointed out that adultification is a component element of racism. So there are issues, and I think we need to be alive to them in all organizations, because it's easy to say, and whilst our focus is on schools, we intend to make sure that through our audit program, through our self-assessment work that we do, that we test all of the organizations, not least schools, and the culture that is prevalent there, and the respect for diversity that is shown to young people. Indeed, at my meeting earlier on tonight, this was a significant focus, and we intend to use the voice of young people to test whether people are applying rhetoric or whether real change is being felt by our young people on the ground. So, as I said, in my overview, we won't accept anti-racism as a statement or a strategy unless it is evidenced. And we'll expect that from each of the agencies and, of course, the people who occupy these rooms as well.
So if I've heard you right, I suppose the sense is that everybody is saying the right things, but we need to get to a point where we're actually seeing the progress in terms of our sort of commitments to anti-racism before we can sort of speak a bit more confidently about the engagement with that approach.
Yes, there are people whose commitment I absolutely do not doubt, not for a second. But one individual is not going to make a difference in what has been a problem that has spanned generations. So we've got to make sure that the leadership that is pursuing this is doing so at all levels and in all places. And in organizations that accept that they have this problem, that will be evidenced by the challenges that they have made, the investigations they have carried out, and the sanctions that they have applied. And so, of course, we will look to the police in that. And I will be asking questions about what has happened in Hackney in the last 9 months since Child Q. But we'll equally be asking that question of others, because when I asked for a show of hands tonight to see who young people felt safest with across statutory agencies, there is, of course, the issue of policing. But the other areas, be it health, be it education, be it social care, they didn't escape a skepticism from many of the young people that I spoke to. So I think it's breathing life into, you know, our commitment to ensure children are seen, that we listen and hear what they say, and that we evidence that we've heard them by being able to show what we've done to help them.
Just lastly on that point about anti-racist practice, about the rollout of your the adultification bias training, and just wondering if there'd been good uptake of this, and in particular among the Metropolitan Police.
So I'll let Rory speak to those numbers, but before, without breaching, you know, I'm aware of this public meeting, but ultimately there are recommendations within the update about how, where, and who should deliver adultification training. I think we've had some excellent support externally, but we have a strong voluntary network of people with lived experience, and there are opportunities to look at how we deliver that training in a way that creates added value by putting people with that lived experience who've been trained as trainers to deliver particular aspects of that in rooms with statutory players, because the added value will be the relationship building and the networking, and to look at how we do it by not just having a one-off, we've done that and ticking the box, because that's almost, you say, job done. People go in a room, they sit there, they listen, they participate, and they leave. But actually bringing them back for a second phase to evaluate what they have done on the basis of it, and indeed to capture case studies. And what I'd just quickly say on that is one of the areas where we have seen some evidence of positive change has been in a case study that we've looked at with colleagues from health, who actually have been brilliant advocates for young people, and they have really challenged around the partnership table. And what we have is circumstance where adultification could have taken us down one path, but appropriate challenge from colleagues in health and working closely with colleagues in policing actually diverted that pathway. And it is one of the positives that I'll come back to at the appropriate time when we publish the next report. But Rory, can you give the chair the update on numbers for the uptake and training with the Met?
Yeah, Chair, I'll have to get you the specific details afterwards. I can forward those on, but we're somewhere near the 400 mark in terms of total practitioners across the system. In terms of the police themselves, we set up a specific session for Safer Schools officers, so they've been trained. That also covered some of our colleagues in the City of London Police as well. And I do know that there's been MPS attendance at the regular sessions that are held kind of every couple of weeks. So I will, we've got an update report, I just haven't got it to hand, but I'll get those numbers to you, Chair, as soon as possible.
Thank you, Rory. I think Councillor Salmon might have had a connected question.
Yeah, no, I really welcome the stuff you were saying about evidencing how things are then actually being done in practice. And you mentioned about having been speaking to young people, I think, today, and I was just wondering, in terms of that sort of auditing process, is that also a formalised bit of evaluating things? So feedback from young people or people working with young people about whether they're seeing improvements, as well as sort of organisations self-reporting back?
Yes. I don't want to go into some of the stuff that will be in the report, but we've met with a range of authentic young people throughout the process of carrying out the update, evaluation and assessment of where we are. Their voices have been key, and they have informed the framework that we'll be recommending to make sure that we don't lose sight of those young voices as we move forward. And what I would say in that regard is that we have a holistic approach, but when it comes to this, you know, I need to be really specific, and it's being feedback from young people of all persuasions. This is an issue about how harm manifests itself to young Black people in Hackney, and we are committed in this update to retaining that focus, and that comes from the feedback from young people. And we have looked at a framework which we're working on with them, which will mean that they are routine and frequent advisors to us as we move forward.
Thank you very much. Before I go to Councillor Suso Runga, I just wanted to welcome our representatives from Hackney Youth Parliament. Sorry, my view of the three of you is somewhat obscured by this screen, but thank you very much for joining us today, and please do feel free to ask questions if you want to. Just put your hand up and hopefully I'll get to see you. Maybe not you, Sudhana, so much, but hopefully Martin might be able to help me. But yeah, thanks for coming. Councillor Suso Runga, please.
Thank you, Chair. The other part of the equation for me is workforce. So I wanted to ask, while there are clearly national drivers behind staffing concerns, is assurance being sought for local plans to address this in a coordinated way from partners, and what are the key safeguarding risks that you foresee locally?
When we went into pandemic, we pivoted our attention and reprofiled our priorities. So priority number one became the health and well-being of our workforce. And we looked at that, you will recall, with regard to how we protected them, how we ensured they were able to work remotely, how we ensured they were able to retain line of sight, and how interoperability could be enhanced so they could work in partnership. And what we saw in the first phase was actually that people responded against the odds, that they rallied to the need of others. And as we came out of the different periods of lockdown, what we saw was, of course, that there was a price to pay for that, and that some staff became fatigued from what they'd been doing. So we carried out an audit with all of the agencies, looking at the lessons learned throughout COVID and how we could apply those in different circumstances should the need arise. And as Rory highlighted earlier, we have pivoted to that again to look at the health and well-being of our workforce, and it's on the agenda for the next meeting. And that is specifically looking at the trends that we currently do, because workforce stability is an issue for Ofsted. It's an issue for every partner across the board, getting, you know, and retaining good staff. So we're also looking at the nuance in the margin around that in the audits that we do, but also around the cost of living crisis. So as we touched on earlier, Rory, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I mean, I guess some of those areas are covered in the strategic threat assessment section of the annual report. And I think it's fair to say that the pressures around workforce stability are resonating across pretty much every partner agency. You know, whether it be vacancy rates, thinking nationally in terms of children's social care and social workers, the use of agency social workers in place of permanent members of staff. That's a recognised issue in Hackney, and I know Jackie and the team are, are working hard in terms of promoting kind of a local workforce strategy to address that particular issue. The police, they've attracted new members of staff, but lots of them are probation officers. They're new. You know, they're green, and that with it brings its own kind of pressures. Alongside, you know, just the numbers game, you've got the demand and complexity of the safeguarding kind of caseloads now, and that adds extra pressures and extra burdens onto very busy frontline staff. So I think we recognise the pressures. Do we know the answers to how to address all of those? I don't think we do, which is kind of why we're flagging in the report that this is an area that we want to look into in a bit more depth over the next few months.
Thank you, because what I was looking for were the actual, what are the tools of the trade for coordination? And you're saying that you, in the next few months, you might come up with what those tools are for working in a coordinated way with partners, the practical tools. That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just come in there? I wouldn't want you to think there are no practical tools at present. When we have done the earlier work around this, we've looked at the occupational health support, the supervision support, the access to external support, depending on the agency. Oh, sorry, I see Jackie's hand is up.
Thank you, Chair. If I may, in respect of our social workforce, I'd say some of the issues that we are experiencing when I speak to colleagues in health, there are massive similarities. So we are starting to have conversations about what we could, how we can help each other, just thinking about that. But in terms of social workers, we're working with the Association of Directors of Children's Services across London. We've got an improvement programme, and we're signed up to the workforce, the social work pledge. So that's got a number of streams attached to it. One is about a cap on agency rates, because we're all fighting for the same pool of agency workers. And so a neighbouring borough would put up their rates by £3, and then the next one would put up their rates by £3. So we've agreed a rate. We've also agreed that no London borough who's signed up to this, and I think there's only a couple that haven't yet signed up and are about to. No London authority that's signed up to the pledge will take on a permanent social worker as agency who's just resigned a permanent post in a London authority for 6 months. And that's having an impact. And it's not to say it's all about agency workers. We have to understand, why is it that people are choosing to go to work with agencies, and what could we do differently? So there has been some research across London, and there are a number of Black and global majority social workers who are leaving the permanent workforce because of their experiences of not having the promotion and the career development opportunities. So of course that means we have to look at ourselves. That's the first place you start. So we're doubling down on our anti-racism. As you know, Hackney Children's Social Care won an award for their work on anti-racism because of the workforce development. We're really invested in making a difference on that. We're also reinvesting in our practice model. So Hackney's had a very strong practice model over the years that people would know as the Hackney model or the unit model. And actually it's kind of crumbled, I'd say, in the last 5 years in terms of its brand, and it needs to be refreshed. So we're onboarding our team in March who are helping us work on that, so social workers can articulate who we are. It's not just about social work there, we're rebranding it so it encompasses all of children in education and the parts of health that we work most closely with. We've introduced in our most under stress parts of the workforce where we are finding it more difficult to even retain agency staff, and this isn't peculiar to Hackney, this is a real London issue. So we have a retention payment for social workers who are on the most high demand, and we have the most throughput in terms of staff. We've looked at our career pathways. We've introduced a new senior social worker role that enables people to step up, earn more money, have greater status, and have greater input clinically into the work that's happening with and helping their colleagues more, but not as managers. And caseloads is a real issue. So the more agency staff you have, the greater your caseloads are, because you're not able to move stuff on as quickly. That sounds terrible. We're not able to help families resolve the issues that are troubling them as quickly as possible. So we do have a strategy for working with this, but it's not a Hackney alone problem. It's a huge problem in terms of the whole social workforce across the country.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you going into the detail, and that's what my interest was. There was no assumption that you didn't have any tools at all. So please don't think that. I know you do, but it's very, very important and it's very helpful. And thank you so much for giving us more detail about those tools. I very much appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much, Jackie. Really, really reassuring, because this obviously keeps coming up for us as a commission in loads of different conversations, and it's really reassuring to hear that sort of coordinated response with the social work pledge, really, and I do hope that we start to see some results from that. Does anybody else have any questions, Commission? Councillor Gordon? Oh, sorry, Councillor Ross.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question about the risks that social media present to our young people, which has been a theme throughout the annual report. And my question is, what local threats and risks have you identified here in Hackney that social media presents to our young people? And is there a strategy or an approach that you've implemented or planning to implement to address these concerns and to ensure that these risks are being addressed consistently across the borough?
Thank you. Yes, Councillor. Well, it's timely given that the Online Safety Act will return to the House of Parliament tomorrow. And I think what's important is that whatever measures are taken are effective. And we have across Hackney launched the Safer Schools app. It's available to every school in the borough. It comes with alerts and warnings. So, for example, a warning was put out about a challenge called Game On Roblox last week. It went out immediately after that because one of the big risks is that people hear these rumors of a challenge, listen to the speculation, and then share it with everyone else as a challenge that is supposed to be about children and young people participating in self-harm and challenges that ultimately lead to suicide. When in essence, the research which we did behind this before we sent our message out identified the fact that it is not a real challenge. It is something that has been speculated about online, and then because of people's natural anxiety and concern, actually law enforcement and other agencies begin to share that information across schools. So getting timely information out is key to us, and that is why through our Think You Know newsletter with the Safeguarding Partnership and also with the Safer Schools app, we were able to send push notifications immediately to our safeguarding professionals to say, do not propagate this message. If you are talking to someone who talks about it, make sure you explain to them that the threat in essence is not real. We do have issues, broader issues that would be peculiar to us with regards to how some groups will use social media. And we are looking at that as we move forward into our serious youth violence. But one of the things I would say is that our commitment is not to look at social media as something which is novel and distinct. It is fundamentally integrated into the lives of young people today, and they're simultaneously online and offline. The Online Harms Bill tomorrow will talk about whether or not they're going to jail CEOs of big social media companies if they don't deal with risks online. I think that's a flawed position. Facebook, year before last, turned over $188 billion. 97.5% of that was generated by advertising revenue. They have more money than some countries. They will fight on that. The key issue, and we're talking to other colleagues in government, is actually attacking the revenue stream. But what we need to do is we need to help those who focus on technology to understand it's the context of a child's life offline. So if you consider what's harmful online, because that is that which is not illegal but harmful. If I'm a young person with low self-esteem and I go onto your Instagram page and look at your pictures of your perfect life, that can be harmful to me. I can go into another environment where I will be exposed to material that's more obviously harmful, because I've got concerns about my appearance, my look. So ultimately, it's a difficult area. We're looking at it at present. But what I would say to every councillor is where you can encourage your schools to download and use the app. It's for parents, it's for teachers, it's for students. Then you will always have the information you need to make more informed decisions. And that is our philosophy, our strategy in this is educate, empower, and protect, giving people the right information early. Hope that's helpful.
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you.
Got Councillor Gordon and Councillor Binny Lovett, please.
Chair. Yeah, thanks very much for this. And I think there is some synergy between that question and the next question really about mental health. So you've highlighted in the report about the increased demand for mental health arising out of the pandemic and other causes, and the startling waiting lists for children to access specialist help from CAMHS. I mean, I think first steps it's around 12 months, and obviously an awful lot can move on in the young person's life over a period of a year. So I just really wanted to hear your views really about, this is as a safeguarding concern, and how confident you are about strategy to address these waiting times and the unmet need, and to ensure that young people get the help they need more quickly. And I think you also reference in the report the alternative of online services. So I've really got an additional question about how confident you are about those services providing adequate support for young people. I mean, you've obviously mentioned the complexity of dealing with things online. Are we confident that is an adequate alternative to face-to-face provision? And if not, how can it be, what can we do about it? Thank you.
We're in a difficult position, and as difficult a position as we've ever been. I think one of the problems, and you say it links to the previous question, which it does, I don't wish to be political, just wish to be factual. The current government are quite happy to point the finger at others, but ultimately the context of the problems that we face here don't lie necessarily on the internet. They lie in the circumstances of young people's lives offline, where there's been insufficient investment in children and adolescent mental health services, where we don't have enough money being invested in policing in this area, in health in this area, or indeed in education. That creates an environment where young people's anxiety taken onto the internet is exacerbated and often accelerated. To come back to your other point about online or offline therapy, when we are under the pressure that we are, and we're under massive pressure with CAMHS, and that's not something that's unique to us, then I think the lessons from the pandemic were properly certified and accredited access to counselling was an alternative to keep young people in touch with those professionals who can support them during difficult times with their mental health, I think is the right thing to do. But the partners are having to pivot to what works best at this moment in time, because they do not have the resource to deal with the offline drivers of harm that are manifesting themselves post-lockdown. We are seeing a doubling in crisis intervention. We're seeing the waiting lists for CAMHS going up. So there's nothing I can say to make that sound better, except to say that I know every safeguarding professional, from children and family services through to our colleagues in the front line in health, are doing the best they can with what they have. But there simply is an absence of real investment in those areas to make a difference. And that's going to take time to fix.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think that's probably all you can say about most of my question. But I mean, I think just really to expand the point a little bit about online. I mean, that phrase can cover a variety of things, from adapting, appointments, one-to-one meetings, having them over Zoom rather than in a room, to young people just being referred to a website and resources. And I'm quite concerned about that, the latter being seen as a sort of something that can fix this issue. So that was just what I wanted to know.
I think there are two different things. One, when a young person goes online to one of the health. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Helena Burke, and I do a lot of work within our WAMS project, our Wellbeing and Mental Health in Schools. So I might be able to add a little bit to that, if that's okay, Jim. As you're probably aware, we have got CAMHS workers working in schools, and that's been funded through health, and it's about kind of really a very tight resource being used a little bit differently. And forgive me if I'm telling you things you already know around this, but they're not doing clinical work in schools, but they're doing preventative work in schools. And that's been really significant in trying to help schools with early identification, and looking at the impact that we can have on waiting lists that way, so that we're not waiting a year for a child when they're hitting a crisis point. The other resource that they've brought in is the mental health support teams that you may be familiar with. And through those, we've got educational mental health practitioners who do a year-long training course, but actually start seeing young people during that time in school. And again, they're a very early intervention, working with low mood, anxiety, with manualised programs. So all of these were about trying to mitigate some of the situation for young people before they get onto CAMHS waiting lists. In terms of the online work, yes, you're exactly right about that range of offers, and that we do have that range of offers in Hackney. So we've got something called Kahoot, which is for very, very early concerns, which is a self-referral for children, and it's exactly the sort of thing you talk about. But in between, we have another program called Silver Cloud, which is for older young people. It is an online program, but it's monitored. You have to be monitored by a CAMHS worker to be on that. So it's check-ins regularly, and it's monitored by mental health professionals. So there's a real portfolio being brought in a whole kind of range of creative ways through the work of health and education together. I hope that wasn't stuff that you already knew too much of.
Can I just come back in to top and tail that? I wouldn't want, regardless of that good work, to create the impression that there is not a crisis with access to CAMHS services with our young people, because there is, and I think there's a lot of good work going on to mitigate, to divert, to supplement that work, but there is a real problem that all of that good work is simply not going to be able to manage.
Thank you, Jim. I'll just take two last questions and then we'll move on. Councillor Binny Lubbock and then I think Councillor Selman.
Yeah, I had 4 sort of observations and questions that all kind of come under a bracket of issues that the report highlights that probably affect adolescents more as a proportion, but obviously not exclusively. And so sort of to tie that all together, the question really is, who's responsible for developing the practice model for the adolescents and safeguarding strategy? But the points that were kind of raised in the report include child sexual exploitation. It kind of highlighted Red Thread as a key partner, and I wonder if there's other partners working on this area. The eating disorder services, kind of what are the impacts of the closure of routine referrals, and is there some more detail on that? You highlight that overcrowding is a factor leading to children going missing, and I imagine that's also predominantly adolescents, and so is overcrowding considered a risk factor, and how's that being addressed? And I just noticed as well that care leavers, in terms of the support the city is giving, they seem to be getting health support and accommodation, which wasn't highlighted in the Hackney section, so I'm wondering if there's some learnings there as well.
I mean, all we've been doing is really learning the last number of years on the curve that we've been on with safeguarding adolescents, and as I said earlier, I think we're moving to a much better place. We're combining the work that we're doing across a range of harms that were once looked at individually. And of course, we're bringing all the partners in, not just those that are mentioned, but indeed Children and Family Service chair of the group that's looking at this. I think it's difficult to compare and contrast what the city are doing because they have such a small number of children. I think within that age bracket, there are about 1,013 or 14 children in the city, and I think there's 600 and something that fall into the lower age category. I see Jackie's her hand up. I was going to let Rory come in on that bit, but I'll give to Jackie.
In respect of the eating disorders, the providers and the commissioners of the particular service have been looking at refreshing pathways, and they've done that in consultation with parents and with young people as well as, so it's been a kind of collaborative over a number of sessions to try and work out the best way of meeting need at the kind of, as an early presentation, and so that we can prevent as many coming to crisis as possible. I think it's fair to say that in terms of, we've also done a similar look at the support for LGBTQI+, and crisis interventions. So using that model with the commissioners, with the providers, and looking at residents or service users to look at what the experiences are and get intelligence about what could be different. I think there's not an issue of a lack of will. It's actually really difficult, and locally it's not even that the funding's not available. It's that we are unable to, there's not enough staff, there's not enough trained clinicians to work in the CAN service, I think is one of the critical issues locally and across London.
Councillor Salmond, if you'd like to come in.
Yeah, it was just a quick question in terms of the inclusion of relevant agencies now within partnership, just to get sort of a sense in terms of how that engagement is going with the designated agencies, and also in particular in terms of the work of reaching out and engaging with the voluntary sector organisations that are working with young people. You mentioned earlier about the training, which sounds great, but please a little bit more about that.
Under the Children's Social Work Act, as you quite rightly say, the Safeguarding Partnership is able to designate relevant agencies, which is what we're talking about. And we have done that for all of those agencies, which means, including academies, by the way, which is quite relevant to some of the work that we're doing at the minute on Child Q. But that means that we will have an expectation that they will participate in safeguarding self-assessment, which will provide us with a line of sight and a level of reassurance that we may not have had from all of them before. But we have adopted, under the leadership of the statutory partners, the broadest possible definition of a relevant agency. And if you're working with children in Hackney, in essence, to date, you'll be captured by being one of our relevant agencies. We have begun writing out to them. We have developed 3 levels of self-assessment for them going into this year. So it's appropriate and proportionate for each of the organisations we target. So we're not using a sledgehammer to crack a nut on that, but looking to engage those relevant agencies in a way where we can support them as they self-assess and then help signpost them to any training or policy development that they need.
Thank you very much. I just had 2 very brief questions I wanted to ask Jim before we move on. And the first was if we have any idea around the timing of the IOPC reports in relation to Child Q. And the second was about the children and young people that we have in social care placements outside of the borough. We know from the reports that we've got a young person, I think it's about 170 something miles away. I know that may just be the only one, but we do also know that we've got 16 who are more than 20 miles away from London. And I'm just wondering if is the Safeguarding Partnership confident that there is an effective protocol, risk assessment process to support and to prevent, minimise safeguarding harms to those children who are placed so far outside of the borough?
Well, I'll answer the easy question first, which is the IOPC question. I mean, I am extremely disappointed that at the point when we're delivering the update report, given that we shared our initial report 9 months ago, that we still have no line of sight on the IOPC. In fact, my most recent update, unless Rory or Jackie wants to correct me on this, was a letter from the IOPC from the then investigating officer who was telling me that they had stood down and that they were leaving, and indeed that they had been replaced by another, and that was within the last few weeks. So ideally we would have had that prior to the publication of the update report, but we don't, and that's where we are at the minute. I'd heard different things, that we were at a stage where it was about to be released, and then within a few days got the email from the investigating officer to say they'd hand it over to someone else. So it's still a work in progress for them, as far as I'm aware. And I'll hand over the difficult question to Jackie.
So in respect of children who are placed at distance, the oversight of those placements is through me. So I have to authorise within, I think it's 72 hours, any placement that is made over 20 miles from Hackney. It's not something we enjoy. It's not something we want to do. You will be aware, it was in the media over Christmas, I think as well, about the difficulty we have in sourcing placements for some of our most vulnerable young people, and it can be incredibly difficult to get placements locally. It's not what we want. Sometimes we may have to place a child at distance for various reasons, such as their own safety. Unfortunately, in terms of the secure estate, if a child needs to be in a secure accommodation, at the moment there's nothing locally, so they are going to be travelling from distance, and that's a really traumatic experience. But we are working again across London, pan-London, to remedy that particular situation. So for any child who's placed at distance, I have to see the view of the independent reviewing officer, the view of the child, the view of the designated health person, the view of the virtual school, the view of the head of service, and then it comes to me. So, and there's all sorts of criteria that I would look at. And for some of them, I will say it has to come back to me. I'll approve it for temporarily, and it has to come back to me, and it goes in people's calendars, and they have to come back to me within a specific number of weeks to review those. So there is a great deal of oversight. There's not a great deal of joy at placing children at distance, but we're always working to bring children as close as possible back into the borough.
Thank you for that, Jackie. I've just got one last question from Sudanese, please.
Hi, sorry. Before I start my question, I thought I'd introduce myself quickly. I'm a member of Youth Parliament for Hackney, and I'm the Young Speaker of Hackney. And my name is Sudanese Top. So apologies, I'm going back to mental health. But my question was about the prevention tactics within schools and about there being camp staff in schools. Personally, as a former student in Hackney, I've just started university, I have not seen any of the CAMS workers in schools, and I was actually on the list for counselling for a year and left school before even having one session of counselling. My question was, is the prevention tactics open to all young people in schools, as many may not show that they are struggling with something? Is it possible to have these camp staff be more visible in schools, work with students generally, do assemblies, stuff like that? Because if I even asked my friends, they wouldn't know that there was a camps worker in schools. So that was my question. Thank you.
For sure. Yeah, thank you. That's a really helpful question, actually. So the work is preventative work, so they don't actually see children doing clinical work. So, they don't cut lists in that way. But really recently, in the last sort of 18 months or so, things like assemblies or running groups, where with parents, for example, so being much more visible and having that role around normalizing the fact that lots of us have mental health problems at different times, and reaching out for help early is exactly the sort of work that they're starting to do more of. So you're spot on. Those are the sorts of things they need to do, and we're hoping that kind of work's starting to grow.
Sorry, if I could just add, the WAMS workers in schools, Sudanese, they're not there to do the one-to-one counselling per se. They're there to assist the school staff identify children who may be struggling or showing initial signs of struggling, and then signpost them all to getting support. So it'd be brilliant if we could have them in every school, but that would be very tricky to try and resource that.
Well, just before I bring Jim in, I think something I've taken from what Sudanese was saying, though, is that it feels like the voice of the young person is missing from that process, because what Sudanese is saying, I suppose, is that young people are hiding what they're experiencing, and I suppose to what extent are young people involved in that conversation about helping professionals to identify what challenges young people might be experiencing and how they may be presenting, especially thinking about the demographics that we have in Hackney and the various different sort of socioeconomic backgrounds that people come from. I'd imagine that we need to do a piece of work which I'm sure you've done. I'm not making any assumptions about that not having been done, but yeah.
So young people's voice is one of the areas that we asked the CAMS workers to work with on the action plan that they put together. It's definitely an area that needs more work. Looking at the demographics is also part of it. So asking, one of the things that CAMS workers are helping schools with is analysing who gets to counsellors, who gets the early help. Is that looking equal across boys and girls? Is that looking equal across different ethnic groups? So those are exactly the sort of areas that we're working on. We wouldn't say we're there on any of them, but they're all areas that are moving forward, hopefully.
Thank you. Jim, did you?
I just really wanted to finish on a high note by thanking the 3 young people sitting behind me, because they were part of the team that met tonight in the Tomlinson to help critique and advise on the work that we're doing around Child Q. And they were excellent ambassadors for the Youth Parliament. And I look forward to working with them in the future.
Thank you very much. And we're going to bring this item to a close now and move on to the next item, item 5, which is unregistered educational settings. And thanks again, Jim, for all of your work on that report. It was a very detailed report and really, really helpful with your follow-up. Sorry, just realised that I hadn't said that before. Moving on, just wanted to acknowledge your work and Rory's around that. So item 5, in response to local safeguarding concerns, the Commission undertook a review of unregistered educational settings, abbreviated to UES in the report, just in case keep seeing that, in 2017-18, and made a number of recommendations to improve safeguarding and oversight. However, in the continued absence of new primary legislation, attempts by agencies and local partners to establish regulatory planning via regulation, health and safety, and safeguarding oversight of children that attend UES have proved challenging. Therefore, given the ongoing safeguarding risks to children, the Commission retains regular oversight of this issue within its work programme. The Commission has received multiple updates on this important issue, and the latest update is at page 203 of the report pack. For this item, we again have Jim Gamble, the independent chair of the City and Hackney Safeguarding Children Partnership. We also have Rory McCullum, the senior professional advisor. We have Kate Cracknell, the head of Wellbeing and Education Safeguarding. We also have Billy Baker, the lead officer for Pupils Out of School, and Donna Thomas, the head of Early Years, Early Help and Wellbeing. We have around 25 to 30 minutes for this item, so can I ask officers to briefly summarise in no more than 5 minutes, please. Take it that the Commission have all read the report, and perhaps just to focus on the progress and practical achievements since the last update in January 2022. So handing over, I'm not sure who wants to kick us off with this one.
Can I just say before they start, there is a bit of a tag team for the reasons that you identified. So you will have Kate and Rory dip in for this item, but Kate will start. Thank you.
Okay, so our position on UESs is largely unchanged, really, from the update that we gave in January 2022. And that is really because we feel it continues to be a high-risk area of work, because we feel unable to be assured of the safety of the children who attend UESs in Hackney. We have a better embedded UES protocol. We have a better framework of oversight, I suppose, or more established anyway. It's been established for longer, but there is still no minimum standard of safeguarding or curriculum in our unregistered education settings, and that's largely because they are not able to be classified as schools. They are, in Hackney particularly, yeshivas, and they deliver a curriculum that is too narrow for them to then be defined within the definition of schools. And because of that, they're not then able to be overseen by the regulatory framework, and they're outside of Ofsted's jurisdiction. There had been some optimism that the schools bill that was published in May last year would bring about some enhanced powers, because it would widen the definition of schools for us to be able to fit unregistered education settings under it, and therefore Ofsted's powers would be able to be triggered. However, the schools bill was shelved in December last year, and that has left us really in the same position with the same challenges that we've had in that area for some time. So I don't know if Rory, Jim or Billy, who are much more experienced in this than me, want to add anything to that.
Hi, Rory. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm sure Jim will come in. I guess from my perspective, the report is just very similar to the one that was produced last year. There's no progress without change, and in this context, we've been trying to lobby to change legislation, and we've been trying to change minds, and we haven't achieved on either front, despite our best efforts. And despite the record showing how much effort has actually gone into offering a level of support to the community to strengthen their safeguarding arrangements, and of course the lobbying to government, which we were optimistic about the schools bill, but again, sadly, that, as Kate is saying, seems to have been shelved. So we're nearing a decade now where we've almost been having the same conversation at each scrutiny. And it feels far from acceptable that we still have a significant number of children out of our line of sight in terms of their safeguarding in the context of their education. And I think a number of years ago, we commented around the two-tier safeguarding system that seems to be in play, where depending on which school you go to, and I'm using school in the loosest possible way, but depending on which school you happen to attend, that is, that will mark how effective the safeguarding provision is. And as I said, it just feels unacceptable that we're still in the same position after so many years.
I've written to the Secretary of State for Education to flag my concern about the schools bill, and I've requested a conversation about how we can get a statutory instrument or increase the statutory support to safeguard children who are being educated in unregistered schools.
Deputy Mayor Bramble.
Thank you, Chair. Only to highlight that the protocol that officers have in place now is a strong unregistered education setting protocol that incorporates multi-agency responses, even though we have limited powers. But as set out by officers, the fact that the bill's been removed, there hasn't been as much direction and travel and improvement as we would like to see, because unregistered schools sit outside of that regulatory framework. So I welcome the bill being pulled back, because it means that we don't have a big rush from government on forced academisation. But on this part of the bill, where we were thinking about getting those legislative powers in place, it's disappointing to see government again step back from that. And Hackney's got a long history and dialogue of going back and forth with government on this area. Thank you, Chair.
Sure.
I was trying to resist the temptation to comment, but I can't. Having been involved in this from 2013, I think we take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. We are left managing a problem that is shameful, and the gift to manage lies outside local government. I have met with the head of Ofsted, who is minded the same as we are, that a statutory instrument is required. We carry the risk, but do not have the authority to address or deal with it. And the influence that we have is fundamentally undermined by the whack-a-mole approach that goes on year in, year out. We cannot say at this moment in time where all of the yeshivas in our territorial area of responsibility are. We just don't know. So it goes beyond any curriculum issue. This is, the biggest risk that we face to children, because they're absolutely absent from our line of sight. It's been a problem that continues year on year and is ignored, and will only be addressed, tragically, in the aftermath of something going horribly wrong. And that can't be allowed to continue. Year on year, I mention it in unambiguous terms in our annual report. People are aware of it in the community and around this table. We simply can't continue to nod and worry and wonder, well, maybe we'll get something down the line. It's just not working. And those people with any type of authority or influence within the Heredia community need to stand up and be counted, because we have gone down the path before where we engage constructively. I have visited homes. I have sat around the table and had tea and talked to families. I have visited the synagogue, and we'll get to the point where we're all in furious agreement that we can agree that safeguarding is the primary concern, and we'll move on that. And at the 11th hour, when we think we have agreement, it is whipped away from us, in this instance, unless we could agree to trade off issues that are outside our gift, i.e. Department of Education and Curriculum. So we then lose that progress. And what happens, rather than sustain that, we change the personalities around the table with the community. And they begin a cycle yet again of engaging, building optimism, and taking us to a point where we think we're getting somewhere when we actually get nowhere. And I just think we're at that point where this cannot continue. Central government have let us down yet again. We shouldn't be surprised, but there needs to be something done at a political level to address this within the leadership of the local community. Because otherwise, we will be sitting with fingers being pointed at us, saying you knew about this problem for a long time. We are encouraged to be lawfully audacious. I've sat in meetings where we've been told, get the fire brigade to go in. First of all, you've got to find the premises, then you've got to send the fire brigade in, and you're sending in another agency to try and facilitate a pathway to protect children. And we just can't do it. So I don't know how many times we're going to have to revisit this and nod it through, because we are literally helpless. It's just not good enough. And we need to do something.
Briefly, please, Jackie, and then we'll move on to questions from the
So
Commission.
there are two challenges. So the one is about yeshivas, which aren't classed as schools, but then the other challenge is about unregistered schools where there is a curriculum taking place. So in that situation, Ofsted, we'll follow our protocol. We'll have a meeting with Ofsted and our safeguarding partners as per the protocol, and Ofsted have authority to go in and inspect. And they have body-worn cameras when they go in to inspect. I think about 8 months ago, they were given legal authority to be able to remove evidence. Before that, they couldn't remove any evidence, so they can remove things that say that it's a register. And Ofsted have the powers to prosecute anyone running an unregistered school. So, and this is for anyone who's running an unregistered school where it fits the definition of a school. And we've heard that yeshivas don't fit the definition of a school, so Ofsted aren't going in there. But, you know, it's in Ofsted's gift to act in these circumstances. As Jim says, we are left with, I think it's section 16F of the Children Act 1989, where we can apply to the High Court and ask people to submit evidence and information to us about children. It's completely toothless. It's expensive, it's toothless, and it's not safeguarding children. So for me, part of the conversation I have with Ofsted is, well, what are you going to do? Because when we find something that fits the definition of a school and it's operating illegally, Ofsted does have the power to go in. Ofsted does have the power to prosecute. Now, prosecution isn't what we want, but it doesn't make me happy to have anyone in Hackney being prosecuted. But it worries me a great deal that I have a section of our child population who are out of the line of sight and maybe being educated in dangerous settings. That's physically dangerous settings that aren't appropriate for children to be in learning.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Councillor Gordon and then Councillor Selman, please. Can we take two at a time because we're running over, but I know that we've got some really important questions that the Commission want to ask on this.
Thank you very much. I mean, it's a really, really unsatisfactory situation. I'm sure everybody will agree with that. And it's I mean, I was on the commission when we did this report. It's now 6 years old. It probably was a lot older. It's a lot older than that, and it's it's as people have said, it's a really significant number. Well, one child would be too many out of line of sight. It's a really significant number of children. I mean, thank you very much for being so honest, really, about the challenges of this. I mean, I noticed in the report that, as Jim's sort of eloquently described it, about sort of, you think you're getting somewhere and then things get taken away. You arrange sessions of safeguarding. Is there anything else that you think you can do, really, in terms of engaging, with members of this community, with different members of this community, with different parts of it, or by different people? Is there anything else you think can be done? And this is not obviously, I mean, this issue obviously has Hackney aspects to it, but it's not a unique issue to Hackney, really. Is there any learning from other local authorities who have dealt with similar challenges about how they've dealt with them?
Can I just take the second question from Councillor Selman, please?
On the schools bill specifically, so my understanding is that or the formal confirmation of that came from the select committee just before Christmas, and that it being pulled back was largely due to some of the other issues that Deputy Mayor Bramble was touching on. That there was an indication at that on this specific issue, that there might still be an appetite to prioritise doing something around about that, including potentially sort of other legislative routes. And I was just wondering, you mentioned that you'd written to the Secretary of State, if that is something that you've had any indication back about what that might look like. And then coming back to Jim's point about how essentially, I know that people have been raising this for such a long time, but escalating it again at this point. Your thoughts on any further stuff from a public affairs perspective, and whether at this meeting or outside of this meeting, if there's ways that as a commission that is something that we are able to support as well, which I know we have done in the past.
So in respect of our conversations with the Orthodox Jewish community, we have very healthy relationships on a lot of levels. So I chair a termly strategic meeting that's held at Interlink, where members from the community come, and we're developing a strategy together. And we've made some great inroads in terms of health, in terms of childhood immunisations, and working quite closely together on some child mental health and some SEND. And Jason and his team have been doing some work with some of the registered independent schools on curriculum development. So in lots of ways, we work collaboratively and in the interests of children in the community very well, and we've made some significant strides. It is the unregistered education settings that are the big sticking issue for us. And that's the one that's most difficult to make headway. And that's the bit where I am most concerned that children may not be safe, and we have no way of guaranteeing or overseeing that.
You have a follow-up question in relation.
Quick question.
Was it a follow-up question? Because Councillor Selman's question hasn't been answered yet.
So my letter to the Secretary of State went last week, given that the news about the schools bill not going ahead came about in December, and we've had several changes of Secretary of State in the last few months. So I wanted to make sure that she welcomed her into the post. I'm glad we've got someone that we can hopefully work with. So it's early days in terms of a turnaround. As I say, it went last week to her. I shared it with Jim in advance. With regards to public affairs work, I think we wouldn't turn down any support, would we? It'd be helpful to think outside of here how we can work collaboratively, and Councillor Bramble is very keen, I know, to forward this agenda, so we can have conversations outside of here about what might be helpful.
Chair, can I just say, I mean, we sought a statutory instrument in 2013-14, which could be an order in council. We were told that we needed primary legislation and a vehicle for that. to go ahead. There was a debate that I was privy to in meetings with ministers and DfE officials where there was no certainty that actually you did need primary legislation, that it could be done another way. But it will not be done up to and until it becomes a priority. And I think we perhaps need to start thinking about raising awareness publicly in every way that we can, so that every parent who sends their child to a yeshiva, to a location that is out with our line of sight, understands quite clearly that they are sending their child to an environment that doesn't have the same standards, the same protocols, the same training, the same vetting, the same level of reassurance around safety as every other child in Hackney is getting. You know, we need to make sure that there is nowhere for anyone to hide on this issue, because that's what happens. There's an ambiguity. You know, I've heard it suggested that we turn up outside, you know, and take each child home in order to do it. Whatever we do, we need to do something, and it needs to be effective, and it needs to be two-pronged. It needs to be however we engage here by raising awareness, and however we engage the government in a meaningful way publicly that makes clear the problem that we are facing, that we have been facing now for 9 years, where the solution has been on the table and they have consistently year on year failed to deliver on it.
Councillor Salmon.
The follow-up, is that all right?
Follow-up.
Yeah, so that part of the preamble, so my follow-up question had been going to be, which was about parental engagement, and just getting a sense of either what we have tried to do already in terms of parental engagement. So I think there's a newly appointed dedicated systems leader for parental engagement, if they've made any sort of headway, and if not, is the plan to put in place a plan for sort of more robust parental engagement in the way that you were just describing?
On parental engagement, I mean, we have these good relationships with different people across the same community, but we're still not able to identify and locate and engage with the yeshivas. There's a significant problem. We have before tried sending leaflets home. We've tried a range of other campaigns. I think this comes down to the leadership of the council, actually, with those people with the most significant clout standing up and calling this out and doing it repeatedly and repeatedly until we're able to address it. And that sounds like a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but actually we've been round the block on this. And you know, it will come this year. I hope it doesn't pass this year in the way that it normally does, because everyone gets so busy with all of the other challenges that we face that we move on in the hope that somebody else is going to fix it for us. They will not fix it without the appropriate twofold pressure, calling out the government and raising awareness with parents in that particular community.
I'm aware I didn't answer Councillor Gordon's question, which was about collaboration with other authorities. So there are 6 other authorities where there are significant Orthodox Jewish communities, and I have been in contact with my counterparts in every one of those authorities and have conversations with them. And post the pulling of the schools bill, I've had an invitation from one of the Northwest authorities to have a conversation about what might be helpful in terms of next steps. I've had lengthy conversations with Gateshead and with Essex, very different communities with very different challenges, and also in terms of the space that's available. So part of the challenge for us is that Stamford Hill is very small, very compact, and some of the other authorities where there's more space, there's been more ability to offer premises to because of the offer of premises, we're able to be more collaborative around some of the issues to do with the yeshivas. And I think from my understanding that our local community is more committed to boys being educated in yeshivas than some of the other communities as well.
Thank you, Jackie. I've got just take another couple of questions. I think Councillor Binny Lubbock, Councillor. Okay, 3.
Councillor Benny
I'll just be very quick. Just following on to that, I'm wondering if rabbis have been engaged as sort of leaders of the community, and you mentioned that the risk sits with us. So I'm wondering what the risks are, obviously beyond the unlimited safeguarding risks to children. What are the risks that sit with the council and the partnership?
Yes, we have engaged the union itself and rabbis. We engaged with a rabbi who was appointed to be responsible for health and safety in the yeshivas, and we felt that if you had a responsibility for health and safety in the yeshivas, that it followed by logic that you would know where they were. But you know, when we get down to it, it is that there is no central authority or accountability that can be apparently be applied. It comes down to the fact that some yeshivas apparently are governed or owned by people who live outside the jurisdiction, including in the United States. So at the end of the day, we need that legislation, and we can do the tactical responses that we'll have to. But what risks do we face? You know, we face the risk that a fire takes place in a place that is locked and hidden from our line of sight, so we are inhibited in supporting and rescuing the children. We take the risk that there are children with special needs who are not being cared for in the way that they should be. We take the risk that something could happen in one of these venues because they're no different in many ways than any other, that a person who is not properly trained and is not properly vetted has got access to young people in an environment that is in essence safe, in an environment that is about keeping the community together and keeping the secret about where they are and how they do what they do. Now, if that doesn't ring alarm bells vis-a-vis some of the issues that we've faced in the past, then I suggest councillors read some of the information on the abuses that took place in other jurisdictions linked to exactly the same problems. Because those are the risks we face. And the day that we face significant evidence of abuse being undisclosed or significant death or injury is the day before this will be addressed by central government. But we need to be that strident about it, because otherwise we just keep coming back and politely discussing it for fear of offending anyone.
Thank you, Jim. I'll take a question from Councillor Laudat Scott. I don't think Councillor Suso-Runga, do you still have a question, or has your question been asked?
No, I just put my hand down because of time, Chair.
And then I have one other question to ask about out of school settings, because we've been focused quite heavily on the yeshivas so far. So, Councillor Laudat Scott.
I've got my questions on the out of school setting pilot. I just want to know, what were the risks identified locally, and what was the development outcomes, and why was engagement so low? Do we know why it was low? And any other key findings or outcomes from the pilot? Could it be brought back to scrutiny? Thank you.
So the out of school settings project mapped 330 settings across Hackney. They are vast and so widely different. They range from church youth groups to football clubs to one-to-one music lessons in somebody's living room. It's literally anywhere outside of a school setting. So it's difficult to pinpoint one particular reason why there was low engagement, other than there is no statutory obligation for them to undertake safeguarding practices. There's a voluntary code, there's guidance, but there's no legal obligation, there's no push to do that. When there was low engagement, in response to that, and to kind of talk to some of the outcomes that we produced, we felt like we wanted to produce some sort of legacy items that could be continue to be used. So we produced a portal, a safeguarding portal, which is a sort of platform that has guides, videos, templates, best practice advice, links to appropriate officers within the council should out of school settings want to connect in that way. There's also an app that is available for parents and for providers, and again that has links to the voluntary code and to guidance. There is a I wondered whether it would be of interest. There's a formal report that was written around our out of school settings pilot project at the end of the project that's been published, and there's also a DFE report that draws quite heavily on the sort of the Hackney outcomes and our Hackney findings that might be of interest.
Thank you very much. Just going to wrap this item up now. I think it feels like it would make sense if we wrote to the government, as this has been something that's been sitting with us for this length of time, and we've expressed since 2017 or even earlier our grave concerns around the situation, and we do recognise the impacts that introducing at least the legislative framework that was proposed would make to this situation, albeit perhaps not going to the quite to the lengths that we would like, but making some progress, which is more than I feel we've been able to make thus far. I think we'd also maybe would ask for a bit more clarity on a few other points that I think had come up when we were discussing in the pre-meet. It would be really helpful to find out a bit more about, go into a bit more detail about what work has been happening with some of the settings that have been identified. So I think we may write to you and ask for some more information, some more clarity around that. I think that we're probably going to have to keep this on the agenda until we're at a point where we're satisfied that there is a legislative framework in place. But until then, I think that we need to be assured as a commission that this remains a priority for us, and that we continue to ask the questions and ensure that no stone is sort of left unturned insofar as what we are able to do as a local authority. So thank you very much, everybody who participated in that item, in particular to Jim and Rory for your contributions to the meeting. We'll now be moving on. Yeah, you're welcome to Cone. Thank you. Moving on now to item 6, which is the outcome of school exclusions, the review update. In response to ongoing high rates of permanent school exclusions in Hackney, the Commission undertook a review of the outcomes of school exclusion, which reported in December 2021. The review made 18 recommendations to the Council. Responses to the recommendations were approved by Cabinet in March 2022. The Commission agreed to review progress against the recommendations 9 months after agreement by Cabinet, and the update report is contained at page 225 of the report pack. For this item, we have Kate Cracknell, the Head of Wellbeing and Education Safeguarding, Donna Thomas, the Head of Early Years, Early Help and Wellbeing, Billy Baker, the Lead Officer, Pupils Out of School, Helena Burke, the Leadership and Management Advisor, and Jackie Burke, Group Director of Children and Education. We don't have as much time for this item, but we do have quite a lot of important questions that we'd like to ask on this one. So can I ask officers to just set out key developments since the last update for 5 minutes, please, and then we can take questions.
Okay, I'll be quick. To kind of frame the report by the acknowledgement that we are committed to continuing to reduce exclusions and to deliver inclusion in Hackney. The recommendations that we respond to in this report form the backbone of our reducing exclusions strategic action plan that's held within Hackney Education, but which spans our partners. The link to that plan, there are clear actions which are accountable to usually single officers or 2 officers, and that plan is reviewed in our monthly reducing exclusions executive officers group. There has been a reduction in exclusions. They're in Hackney, they're down by 20%. There are fewer exclusions last autumn term than we had in the previous autumn term, 21-22. The re-engagement unit was launched in September 2022 in terms of it being universally accessible to all of our schools in Hackney. Prior to that, in the year prior to that, we had a much expanded pilot project. The 70 plus secondary school student referrals that the re-engagement unit has received since September 2021, around 20% of those referrals have an EHCP, and we saw only 3 excluded from that cohort. What else can I say to you? Persistent disruptive behaviour historically has been accountable for around 35% of our exclusions, which have concerned us because it suggested that we were missing opportunities to step in prior to the point of exclusion for a child. This year, our figures so far show a reduction. It's too soon to refer to that as a pattern or even a firm reduction, but only 10% of our exclusions since September have been accounted for by persistent disruptive behaviour. The re-engagement unit has offered around 30 training sessions since it became universal in September of last year, 2022, and those training sessions have reached around 500 school staff. So if I stop there.
Thank you very much. I'd like to kick us off with a question around governance. So from a governance perspective, can officers set out which Hackney education body has oversight and responsibility for the implementation of the recommendations of the Commission? Has the service developed an action plan to support it? Are there specific officers working to deliver agreed recommendations? And how often are the recommendations reviewed?
I think I touched upon that. The recommendations have formed the Reducing Exclusions strategic action plan that sits within Hackney Education, and it's reviewed as part of the Reducing Exclusions Executive Officer Group meetings, which are monthly.
Thank you very much. Deputy Mayor Bramble, did you want to come in briefly?
Thank you, Chair. What wasn't highlighted is there's been a slight reduction of exclusions from this point now in 22-23 than there was at 2021-22, albeit because of the pandemic. I'm not sure how comparable we can use those figures, but at this point in time, there are still less exclusions. Overall, I think there was about 20% reductions of exclusions. However, our exclusions are still high, so there's still work to go. I think it's really important, though, we have to look at disproportionality with exclusions. I don't think we can just talk about exclusions in its entirety. We've got to look at the high numbers, and we've got to talk about the disproportionate effect of Black and global majority children on exclusions. Otherwise, it's a missed opportunity. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to hand over to the Commission. If we can theme our questions, does anybody have any questions around the general overview of exclusion data?
Yeah, I have a question regarding data transparency. So the number and rates of permanent exclusions of pupils are now publicly available at the individual school level. In the interest of improved transparency and accountability, will Hackney Education now commit to regularly publishing this school exclusion data at school level?
Can I just add another question that's sort of related also to data, and that's just about while I recognise that there is a decline, just to sort of echo to some extent what Deputy Mayor Bramble was saying, I think we really do need to be brutally honest about what we're faced with, and that still is that we still have some of the highest rates of exclusions across all London boroughs. So I think that, you know, especially when we're talking about COVID years, also it's really quite, you know, I think we need to really be able to see what we're actually dealing with at the moment. And I think that incorporating data from 2021, 2020, 2021 is perhaps not particularly helpful. And that it is really important for us to continue focusing on the fact that we still do have the second highest rate of permanent exclusions in London, and the second highest rate of suspensions in London. But I suppose while any shift in that in those figures indicates that something is happening. It also indicates perhaps that the progress isn't happening quickly enough within Hackney. So why are our rates still higher than other boroughs? So just to add that to Monique's question.
If I respond first to the transparency question. So they will now be in the public domain, no question about that. And I think that's probably really helpful. We haven't discussed whether, you know, Hackney would want to publish them on a website, but I think one of the things that we're really aware of is how closely we're working with particularly secondary schools, how engaged they are in trying to reduce those numbers, how much they're making use of the training offers around understanding children's behaviour better, and the early help offer and the crisis offer for when children are kind of, you know, right at that exclusion point. So whilst we've got that really high level of engagement, I think I would strongly feel about the sense of working together with the schools is one of the things that's helping us. So I'd want to, wouldn't be my decision, but I think we'd want to think carefully about what would be the benefits of Hackney publishing that in terms of the nature of those relationships that we've presently got moving so positively forward. Does somebody else want to do data, or shall I?
So the question about rates and our rate continuing to be too high, I think is a really important one, and we would acknowledge, we agree that the rates are too high, regardless of how they look in comparison to our statistical neighbours. We want them to be lower, but particularly in regard to how they look in comparison to our statistical neighbours. It's difficult to talk to why, and I think Hackney is very transparent with our exclusion figures, and our diversion processes are child-centred. We aim, if we undertake a managed move, for that to be in the best interest of the child, and not simply to avoid an exclusion, which I think is important. One thing that we are looking into, or that we are going to move forward with this term, is we're aware that we have a lot of early help services in place. We've got the expanded re-engagement unit now. There is the capacity to provide the right help at the right time for children, we hope. But for children who we haven't reached quickly enough, who are at the point of exclusion, we have mapped out a diversion conversation whereby SLT, or head teachers in school, are able to contact a nominated or named Hackney Education Officer who will undertake a discussion around the child's situation. There will be a bespoke set of options issued, and they may be bespoke based on the child's SEND status, whether or not they're a looked after child, or whether they're coming from the sort of mainstream cohort. That diversion conversation is going to be time bound and QA'd, and again, we'll have that specialist oversight, like I said, where necessary, to explore options. So we are aware that there continues to be a challenge.
Yes, Jackie. We have also appointed a diversity and inclusion systems leader, Deborah Robinson, who is a former assistant head teacher at one of our secondary schools in Hackney. She is working very much with all of our schools on developing an inclusions charter with a big focus on anti-racism, and is working really closely with our wider anti-racism work. We had an anti-racism symposium in secondary schools that were hosted in secondary schools and attended by secondary school leaders. And during Black History season at the end of last year, and we have a programme of engagement around the anti-racism issue. I know that all of our secondary heads, primary heads and secondary heads, are really engaged in this, and it's a focus of our conversations frequently. We have expanded the re-engagement unit. So initially it was focusing on primary schools, and from last term, it's been extended to work with secondary schools, and that's also making an impact. Our Young Governors programme is, we're particularly proud of that. And we have a young governor in our Stoke Newington Secondary School, was on Radio 4, and we're super proud of Shakira. and she's already having an impact. So by introducing a younger person's voice and a Black woman's voice into the school system and helping the school thinking about what the exclusions might look like, that's already making a difference. So I think we're using a variety of approaches, from leadership to engagement to looking at our young governors programme, and also really encouraging and extending greater support to some of our younger governors, and particularly our Black and global majority governors across the system, to feel like they're able to speak up, and that when they're speaking up, that their voices are being heard and respected.
Thank you, Jackie. I just wanted to come in on the point about why Hackney Council might publish that data. I would personally argue that I think it's in the same way that I think parents might want to know how likely their children are to get 5 A's to C's. I also think they might like to know that 10% of the student population are suspended from school. Because often I think in the borough, the parents that I've spoken to will often say, I didn't think this would happen to my child. I'd heard that this school was very strict, but I didn't think that would happen to my child. And I think what we've seen in the report is that perhaps it isn't the same case across the piece for our schools. And it feels a bit like not being transparent for the purposes of maintaining and protecting relationships, the local authorities' relationships with certain schools, sort of means robbing parents potentially of the opportunity to bring to light information that should help to inform their decisions. And quite frankly, this is me calling out the schools here. If the schools don't think they've got an issue, then they shouldn't mind if we publish this stuff. Why should, why would that cause an issue in terms of our relationship with the schools if they feel that these sanctions are a necessary part of their behaviour policy? Then they should be able to back it up, and they should be able to explain to parents when they come and visit schools, this is why it looks the way that it does. But I just think in a borough where we are seeing poorer outcomes for certain subsets of children, I think that it's incumbent upon us to share that information with parents so that they can make fully formed decisions about which school, they send their children to.
I think your point is very well made, and certainly something food for thought that we will go away and give some serious consideration to, and we will discuss with our head teachers as well.
It doesn't need to be so much like naming and shaming, but just, when we're publishing, when we've got a prospectus saying these are our schools in the borough, this is what they look like. This is a school that does suspend 10% of the student population. This is a school that suspends 0.5%. Parents can make of that what they will. Sorry, I think we've got some other questions now. I wanted to, so I've got Councillor Suso Runga, and then I will bring in Deputy Mayor Bramble. I think we've got some other, and then Councillor Ross, please. So Councillor Suso Runga.
Thank you, Chair. In the report, it shows that SEND remains a significant factor in local exclusions. So I just wanted to ask if we are confident that schools are complying with the guidance around exclusion of children with SEND.
Can I just bring in Anton? Did you want to just? Is there something that you wanted to follow up on?
Yes, I just wanted to add to some of what you heard from Jack and also Councillor Bramble's point. Every school, when it has a visit, the analysis of data has that intersectional lens on it. So we work with and challenge and support schools in looking at and analysing their exclusions and their suspensions by ethnicity and increasingly SEND. Some of what's new, these past 2 terms, we've instigated joint analyses, reviews, school improvement, school performance with our SEND services. And we launched at the beginning of the year our multi-agency planning meetings, which secondary schools are responding to positively. One other action that is new and potentially becoming significant is we've instigated director conversations with some of the MATs, in fact with all of the secondary federations, and we call them in where the exclusion and suspension figures show significance, either because they're high or because a particular group is being excluded more. And in those meetings, the director will confront the CEO or the exec head about areas such as their behaviour policies and the degree to which those policies are carried out in those schools. And yet in other schools who are similarly high performing, why the pattern of exclusions is very different. So that I think we're getting sharper and stronger in that area.
And sorry, in terms of Councillor Siso Runga's question around SEND quite specifically, sorry, did you want her to ask that specifically about complying with guidance around exclusion of children with SEND? Are we confident that the schools are compliant?
I'll start the reply here. In the discussion and dialogue with the schools, the working with our SND colleagues, those schools, that data is actually shared with the schools and discussed, and on a case-by-case basis, every suspension or exclusion, if it's an SEND person or indeed any other overrepresented group, there's a drill down there to understand why. As you heard from Helena, we offer reviews, analyses regarding the factors that led to that point in that school's behaviour regime. So I don't know if anybody wants to add to that.
Oh yeah, sorry, I can come in. Sorry, oops, sorry. Would you like me to come in here? So it's really awkward being online. I could put my hand up. So it's just to sort of say, I mean, in terms of schools with SEND, I think on the whole, yes, they are complying. I think where they are not, we have seen that, and that's certainly come from the outcome of a number of IRPs that took place last year. We had 3 IRPs, independent review panels. Sorry, I'm talking in acronyms. 3 independent review panels that were quashed, that had SEN playing a role in that somewhere. I think that was a learning curve for some schools. We saw 2 of those 3 reinstated back into school. I think one of the difficulties for children with SEND is the options available as alternatives, especially those of EHCPs, where a child does not have an EHC, for example. It's a more simplified process to move towards a managed move, for example, or to look at some form of alternative placement. Where the child may have an EHCP, that becomes more difficult as part of the consultation process, and the timeframes around that become somewhat extended. And I think that is something that we certainly are looking at and we continue to look at. But like I'd say, I think on the whole, schools are aware. It doesn't say that they're not excluding and there still needs to be work to done. But where they are failing, they're certainly being picked up and challenged on it.
Thank you very much, Billy. I'm going to bring in Deputy Mayor Bramble and then I'm going to go to some questions from the Commission. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. You spoke a bit about the detail and transparency. I think it's a good opportunity to just highlight that the primary school sector haven't permanently excluded children since 2018, and if that's changed, officers haven't updated me on that. So yes, in terms of short fixed terms exclusion, there's still an improvement to make in primary schools, but I think there's a real opportunity for our secondary sector to kind of learn lessons and work closely with primary sectors, thinking about how they've been able to maintain the same children in primary school, work through that transition so that the secondary school can work with them and support those children in the same way. Now, I know children at different transitional periods of time need different support and exhibit different behaviour, but actually these are the same, broadly, these are the same children that are going through a whole of our primary school and not being excluded to then, unfortunately, go into our secondary sector and not being supported in the same way. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bramble. Interestingly, on that point, a head teacher from one of our primary schools actually shared those sentiments in the local press, I think, saying after years and years of working very closely to support children with special educational needs to remain in education and to flourish, to then send them on to a local secondary school only to see them excluded within a few months was devastating for them. And you know, they felt that there was some work to be done around potentially working with local primary schools to to find out what's been working and how they've been able to successfully support the families. And I do recognise it's completely different context, but I do think that there's something in that. I've forgotten your name.
Hello, my name is Mia. I'm a member of Hackney Youth Parliament. I just wanted to ask, do you think that there are like appropriate or not appropriate, but suitable trainings for teachers when it comes to dealing with children with SEND? And I mean, for example, myself, I'm autistic, but I'm higher up on the spectrum. Do you think that some teachers acknowledge the fact that some people might still have these learning disabilities or difficulties, but it's not as obvious? And do you think that these students sometimes get overlooked compared to students with who might be lower on the spectrum?
The short answer is yes. The work on training is absolutely ongoing, and looking. Anton mentioned our new multi-agency planning meetings in the team around the school, and one of the big pushes through that is schools having more access to training in terms of how to support children with a wide range of SEND needs in the classroom to achieve. One of those in particular is looking at girls with autism, which is a really, not as well understood as it should be. So you're absolutely right, that area of training is one that we're keeping working on. It's going to be done through the team around the school. The REU is offering it and WAMs are offering it. So there's lots of different opportunities for schools to access that. And they're really delighted to have the training.
I wanted to ask a question on school behaviour policies, and my question is whether Hackney Education has done a review on making sure that school policies do not disproportionately impact children of the global majority, because I'm sure we've heard many cases in Hackney, one that was maybe around 3 years ago regarding hair, and also I wanted to bring light onto exclusions through searches in schools. Some searches can be very excessive and they are very random at times. And say, for example, in my former school, phones were banned. And if at one random time we were searched and a phone was found in my bag, I would be excluded for 5 days. Or suspended or whatever you call it. In my opinion, as a young person, I don't think that is right. Being excluded or suspended because finding a phone in your bag, it's kind of silly. And I wanted to ask about what Hackney Education is doing with the school behaviour policies regarding academies or like independent schools, because I'm sure that you can sort of control the schools that are not academies, but with academies, I'm not sure what Hackney Education is able to do. So I just want to ask on that as well. Thank you.
So all schools have the right to write their own behaviour policies. There are absolutely some statutory things that should be in there. For example, issues around equalities, and those are the things that will be picked up by Ofsted and will be picked up by us as school improvement partners when we visit schools. And you're absolutely right to identify that there have been some breaches of that in recent years that have been picked up and challenged. And Anton might want to talk about some of the work that's been done more broadly around, for example, hair policies and how those things have been challenged across the schools. What our role is with behaviour policies is to help schools think about how they can be as effective as possible. So we don't have the authority to get into things like whether phones are allowed or searching policies, but we do absolutely have a role in working as partners to make sure that there are policies that support the best behaviour in the school, that support learning, and that's from the work we were talking about earlier, that actually support children's wellbeing and mental health as well. And one of the things all of the policies should include is what's called reasonable adjustment, which is how those policies might be applied differently for a child who may, for example, be unable to follow it due to an SEND need. Anton, I don't know if you wanted to add.
I think that may be reference to early work where we collaborated with the Federation in helping them review their uniform and behaviour policy that led to a revision of their hair policy. but we haven't finished with that particular academy. Work will continue, but what we learned from that was, one of the things that we learned from that was actually the use of student voice and getting them to communicate their lived-in experience, the experience being a result of that particular school's policies, and that's quite a strong form of evidence and a strong leverage. And part of the reason why, with the director, we're having termly conversations now with some of the federation, but with all of the federations. Not every academy is in a multi-academy trust, all but four aren't, and two of them are looking to join, and two of them at present are standalone. That said, we continue the discussion now, not just with the head, but with the exec head and the CEO. We're also starting to look at collating the complaints that we sometimes get from students and from parents about those policies. We don't always get that information, but we think that the schools and the person at the top needs to know, and the chair of governors, in order to effect the changes. So that's an ongoing piece of work, and we haven't ruled out. We'll rule in conversation with the secondary heads as a collective about their generic approach to behaviour and approach to including more. I have to say that some of the academies, it's not just academies, some of the maintained schools have made great advances at working both with their student groups and with some of their stakeholders, with their parent groups. I can think of a couple of community schools, one not far from here and one down the road, where there's been good advances made in reviewing not just behaviour, but things like well-being and the use of voice in shaping the response to sexism and homophobia. So increasingly, students are helping us lead the way forward.
Just
Sorry, that was a
on
bit long.
Just on that point, and I think Councillor Gordon also wants to come in, but just you'd mentioned, Anton, about collating some of the complaints that come through, which I think is hugely helpful. I wonder whether we can go a bit further than that, because that's a self-selecting group of people who have the wherewithal to submit a complaint. But we recognise that for a number of different reasons, there are lots of families who perhaps wouldn't have been able to had the confidence to submit any sort of complaint. And I wonder whether we are able to find out through some sort of consultation with the public about, you know, what the feeling is among children, families, parents about school behaviour policies. It just feels that we're working with a really small sample there that perhaps isn't very representative. So if there's any work that's going to be done around that, I wonder whether we can try and broaden that sample a bit. I'm just going to, did you? Okay. Yeah.
In response to that question, can I just say that Hackney Schools Group actually did a thorough piece of work. I think we've lost the online audience.
Everyone's videos online.
Okay, right, okay.
I've got them on the screen, so they should be.
So Hackney Schools Group has different subgroups, one looking at curriculum, one looking at belonging. And over the last 2 years, they did actually, I don't know if this has been reported before, they did actually an in-depth piece of work with a nominated number of schools. And they did that work almost independent and with the schools, working directly with parents and the school cohort, the school community. And that was really, as the sentence says, or the title says, looking at belonging and well-being and how they feel that they are members of the school community and what the strengths and weaknesses were. And conversations around race, identity, belonging, behaviour policies, acceptance all came up. And that piece of work with a small cohort of schools is actually being extended to a wider cohort of schools, and that fits into the anti-racist work that we're also doing as a local authority. So those questions have been asked. I think we also need to add that We've spoken a lot about some of the new systems we've put in place, such as the expansion of the re-engagement units, such as the WANs work, such as the team around the schools, and all of those work collectively are interventions really about making sure that we identify needs, whatever those needs, whether they be educational needs, whether they be environmental needs, whether they be parenting needs, that we identify them early and put in the support for those families so that those children can thrive and can excel within their school communities as well as at home. So there are a number of initiatives in place and they all complement each other. Also the work that was started in 2018 around trauma informed, and that work is still ongoing. So no intervention in isolation, it's all of those things working together, but they are still relatively quite early. So we're watching them very keenly and as an organisation very committed to those outcomes, because there are, you know, there are children, there are community, and we want them to thrive, we want them to excel. I didn't like hearing myself there.
Councillor Gordon just has a follow up, and then there's a couple wanted to come in.
Thank you very much for outlining all of that work. It is obviously good to hear this through being examined through an anti-racist and well-being lens. I mean, like Councillor Conway, I think we can go further to local authority in relation to behaviour policies. I think we should be in a position really to, you know, to advise schools on what evidence-based best practice looks like. Well, even go further than that in relation to this. I mean, I've asked a number of times really what the evidence base is for zero tolerance behaviour management policies, and haven't really received a satisfactory answer in this forum. So I mean, maybe there is one out there, but I haven't seen it. So I mean, I think there is increasing public, as Conway's outlined, increasing, you know, sort of public debate about this. And I think, you know, in addition to sort of, you know, more consultation with the communities Councillor Conway's outlined, it would be really helpful, I think, to hear from young people who've been through our system at different stages, young people who are there, and also the sort of young adults who've emerged from our schools, really about their reflections on their sort of experiences, you know, the ones who are in their sort of maybe mid to late 20s. So, and I think this is something that we, you know, that we do need to look at as, you know, as a, you know, as a local authority. It's and you know, take a lead on it, because you know, they're obviously schools have autonomy, but they are our children.
Thank you, and on that point, Sudanese, please feel free to come in, and any of the others as well, because Mia, I do remember distinctly you talking about this when we met last at the Forest Road Hub, and I remember you very eloquently talking about your experiences of the school behaviour policy in your school, and you gave a very interesting perspective on what that's like, not just for children who transgress the behaviour policies, but also those who maybe are in line with the behaviour policies and don't get into trouble, and how useful the behaviour policy is to them. So please do feel free to share if any of you would like to. Sudanese.
It's very quick, so if Mia wants to add on afterwards, I'll definitely let her. I just wanted to go back on the point that Hackney Education had like young people speaking to them. Was this through schools where you sent a representative to a school and a group of young people there spoke to you, or was it through a consultation that was online that the school wasn't really involved in? Because personally, I know that, well, we spoke about this with Jim's meeting previously today as well. When a representative comes to a school and a group of young people are chosen, they are chosen for a reason, because they are known as the golden students. They're known as the smart, the good behaving students, the students who don't come across that much trouble with teachers or SLT. I was one of them students from year 7 to year 11. I was always in those meetings. And those students are told previously before the meeting, make sure the school looks good. So even if the representatives or whoever came to the school doesn't know that, a lot of the time the students who will speak to you about, I don't know, this time behaviour policies, will make sure that, yes, they're speaking about behaviour policies, but they're also sugarcoating it a little bit, making it like not as serious as it actually is. So I just wanted to bring light on that. Thank you.
I wanted to say that since I last spoke to you, there actually has been some progress. One of the teachers who taught me drama when I was in year 11 has moved to a role where she works with young people on the safeguarding team. And that has mean that her timetable has been halved and she spends the other half of her time working with people who might need the advantage or the help. I think that's really good in terms of my school's administration, like admitting when they might need the extra support and not just using the usual tactics of punishment to help children. I also have been working, well, my mentor now is also part of the safeguarding team, and she's been really useful to me as a sixth former. I have a mentee myself, which is also quite useful, and she is also SEND, and although she's quiet, the school that I attend has kind of flagged her because of like behavioral issues and so on and so forth. So I think that's quite useful, and I'm not the only one who does it. Some of my friends do it, but it is an initiative set up by the sixth form, like us students ourselves. So I think that's a good sign of progress. It's early days, and we're hoping to see more changes done, and we've got internal changes in leadership, and it's becoming more modernized. However, there are still very traditional ways that things are set. Like sometimes you'll go to try and find your mentee and they've been put in isolation. You can't really do much to help them then. But it is their way of at least acknowledging that these students need help besides punishments. And yes.
It's really encouraging to hear, and I really do hope that you're able to somehow share what your experiences have been, and to see whether other secondary schools in the borough are able to sort of take your lead on that initiative, because it sounds great to utilise sixth formers as mentors.
Firstly, I'd like, Madam Chairman, I'd just like to thank you. I think it's wonderful to hear your perspective of our young people. Just like to make a couple of points. I am a head teacher in one of our local schools, so it's quite interesting to hear your perspective. The one thing I tell you, students are brutally honest. So I don't know that I could tell a child, go and talk glowingly about the school. They would be completely honest. That's my experience. And yes, you're absolutely right. Many students tend to be the more articulate, well-behaved ones who would normally represent the school, because they're the ones who would put themselves forward for the school council, as an example. But what I do know is that when I have my SIP into my school, she asks for the SEND students to interview them, so she gets a perspective from them as well. And I think it's important. And that certainly has been instructive to me, for example, because I do know there's some head teachers who've been caught out, especially when Ofsted comes around, because usually the ones that they have involved with student voice are the ones you mentioned, but Ofsted would, take a beeline towards those SEND students. So I think school leaders are understanding that now and are actually engaging with the SEND students. And just to answer your question about training, certainly in my school, there is training around autism every year. Sometimes we get that support through the local authority. And, the reality is that most students with autism are actually in mainstream schools. So we can't get away from it. We just have got to ensure that we are capable of meeting the needs of those young people. But I just wanted to say, I think it was quite refreshing hearing your perspective. Thank you very much.
Very briefly, Jackie.
Okay, so I just want to come back to Mia's point about about SEND and every teacher. So just to be clear that the government, whilst it's rowed back on the schools bill, hasn't rowed back on the SEND green paper, and they're moving forward on that, which is developing a more inclusive approach to children with special education needs in schools, and aiming to set some kind of standards for every teacher to have training to a certain level. And I actually welcome that, and I think most of our teaching staff will as well. In respect of the school behaviour policy, the guidance around developing the school behaviour policies was updated by government in September last year, and they create very differences between academies and maintained schools. So academies should publish their behaviour policies and maintained schools must. In terms of developing them, it's very clear it's the head teacher's responsibility to develop the behaviour policy, and there's no reference to developing it with students. So if schools are developing them with students, and schools and Hackneys are, and as Hackney Education uses all of its data to look at how behaviour is manifested in terms of exclusions and how we can do that with Team Around the Child and our re-engagement unit Team Around the School. I think we have quite a good system for working with schools and working on our relationship with schools to be able to understand where things might not be working so well, and that often does manifest itself in higher exclusions or children's behaviour not being contained or managed because they've neither engaged the children in developing that or understanding what it's about, or if the policy isn't being, it's not manifesting itself, it's not being managed properly within the school. But I think it's really important that our head teachers do have conversations with our students. But the role of us in education and Hackney School and Children Education Department is about the relationship with schools, developing that trust. And our relationships with our head teachers are very much around getting the best for children. And I think we do push and pull each other on that. But that is our sphere of influence, in that it's very clear it's about the head teacher, but we do work to influence and support and challenge.
Thank you very much. We'll just have the last few questions now. I wanted to ask a question about the re-engagement unit. It's really encouraging to see the work to sort of expand that. So for me, I'm wondering where this sits in terms of us challenging systemic inequality. In terms of, is there any sort of feedback between what we're seeing in the reintegration unit? So if we can't just have loads of disproportionality in terms of who's being put forward and referred as being the children who are at risk of exclusion. Surely the reintegration unit might see, okay, we've got some disproportionality issues there. What do we do with that information? Because otherwise it's just we're building capacity to deal with potentially systemic injustice instead of actually challenging this systemic injustice. So that was a question I have about the reintegration unit. I don't know if anybody has any other sort of linked questions. Councillor Salmon?
Okay. Yeah, no, it was just because we have the data on number of pupils who had identified special educational needs at the point of exclusion. I was just wondering, do we have any data on whether per exclusions, where there were outstanding requests for support at that point in time, if that makes sense? So like where at the point that somebody was excluded, there might have been either due to waiting lists, things that had not been met, a request for an educational psychologist, that kind of thing, of whether at that point there might have been a plan in place or there might have been stuff in place, but where there was perhaps an unmet need. Do we have that data or the ability to have that data?
If I start by talking about the re-engagement unit, you're absolutely right. It's got a kind of key role there. There's a lot of work done systemically in terms of working with the school, with the family, and with the peer group. There is some direct work done with the child, but it is a systems-led approach. We work to develop capacity in staff. So as part of the team around the school as well, we would be supporting the schools to audit their skill set. We would look at their data to see if it suggests that there is any gaps that we need to fill, and we can provide training within the re-engagement unit, or WAMS can provide it, or somebody within SEND can provide it, depending on who best meets that need, I suppose. There's a lot of work that we do as well around, we have some steering groups set up. So we have those for our primary head teachers, one for our secondary head teachers, but probably our most important feedback loop is we run parents groups And we use the information that our parents share with us, and they are parents of children who are at risk of being pushed out. So they are living that experience, and we use that information to inform our discussions and our conversations with schools, and support them to develop their own practice and potentially their own policies in response to that. And we do a lot of the work that we do with our children involves working with them and canvassing their opinions and their ideas and their thoughts and feeding that back in. So I think the feedback loop that we create is an important one as well, in addition to the training opportunities that we're able to offer.
Be very brief, please. We've got Jackie and Antoinette, and I think we've still got answers to that question, and then we've got Councillor Ross. So very briefly, please,
okay,
Jackie.
So I want to make that connection to the more strategic and tactical follow-up. So that's on the, taking the parents' narratives and using that, and the children's narratives and using it particularly with the schools in question. Under Jason, it's now the head of the School Improvement Service. We've really extended the school improvement remit to really focus on inclusion in its broadest sense. So the data that we get from REU is used in those conversations that the school improvement advisors will be using with schools to really drill down and push back on what practice might look like and how they can make a difference to children. So it's not just at the operational level, we've adjusted our strategic input and our school improvement service to really tackle that as well.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Bramble. I noticed you put your hand down. Did you want to come in?
Oh, yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to say, the work around the re-engagement unit is part of our No Link to Exclude around the work we're steering with schools. It's saying that, if you work with us, here's a free offer and an alternative for children, and how we create those pathways, which is linked to our manifesto commitment. So just wanted to highlight that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And on Councillor Selman's point.
So in terms of thinking about unmet need, if you were talking about a permanent exclusion, the school would have to demonstrate that they had done everything to meet the needs of that child, or an exclusion would be overturned. So it simply couldn't go through. But in reality, in practice, of course, some children that would be permanently excluded might be later found to have a need that wasn't identified then. So, we sometimes find that a speech language communication need might be uncovered for children at New Regent's College, for example. So once they go there, there's the opportunity to do a whole other raft of investigations and check out what's going on. But in terms of being able to say this child was awaiting some support on this, and we haven't done that, an exclusion would be almost certainly overthrown. There might be an occasion where it was like a single serious incident that would make a difference to that.
So where does that include a situation where the school has done, the school has done a lot, but where the bit is an external resource? So they have made referrals but haven't had that back. So the school has done a lot of stuff around, has done everything that is within their power to do, but where because of a waiting list for external resource, would that be that?
So you might, for example, I'm trying to think if there might be a particular case, you might, for example, see a child that was still on a CAMHS waiting list, but the school would have to still have shown that they had done everything else. So, for example, that they'd got an educational psychologist report and they'd taken on all the recommendations of that report, and that they had done everything that had been put forward that was within their power. So I think it would be extremely unusual for that to be the situation.
This is not Hackney specific. This is based on kind of conversation experiences from other places and other boroughs, where certainly the sense from the school was, having done everything that they could do right about it, that they were essentially got to the stage where they felt they were having to exclude because they could not support within that school setting, but that they also felt like they had not been adequately supported in terms of access to external resource. And I guess that's why I'm just, I think that's, I guess why I'm asking whether that is anything that we sort of track or look at all. So I would like to think that it's not something that happens, or that if it got to that stage, there'd be a process where there'd then be a conversation about escalating stuff. but I guess I have seen examples of that happening elsewhere, and it's just knowing if we have any kind of data to track.
We don't collect data on it that I'm familiar with, but I think one of the things that our schools regularly report back to us that they are very aware that they get a very comprehensive offer. If you think about the REU, the team around the school, all of those sorts of things. Did you want to add to that, Kate?
Yeah, I was just going to say in sort of Hackney specific context is the re-engagement unit is multidisciplinary. So we have on our team teachers, we have clinicians, we have psychotherapists, we have a mini CAMS unit which can deliver support. So schools, I hope, would be able to make use of that. There's no cap on the referrals that they can make. And we work in a systemic way, so we support to upskill staff and build capacity to be able to meet the needs of their specific cohort.
Councillor Gordon wanted to come in.
Just really quickly, it's obviously really good to hear about the work of the multidisciplinary work and re-engagement unit, but just could you explain to me the process of how an exclusion for unmet need would be overturned? Because I may have misunderstood, but I understood that was within the governing bodies, that's where the appeal, there isn't, how does that appeal system work, and how confident are you that that always happens? Thank you.
Billy, I'm looking at you for that one.
Yeah, I
Would
can
you be
come
able
in.
to help that?
Yeah, I mean, for example, you could look at, for example, a child that may have additional needs that may not be getting the adequate support that they need in place in school, or it may be identified quite rapidly after placement that the school that they're attending is not suitable, and therefore they need some form of intermediate or kind of interim provision put in place whilst work can carry out and take place around that child. For example, I can think of children that there may be, especially at primary, and I think that's one of the driving factors that have kept our primary exclusions down, is that where there's an immediate trigger or there's a need identified, we can call on, for example, New Regents College and offer a partnership placement where we give the child the opportunity to attend New Regents on a part-time basis and attend their mainstream setting, whilst additional resources are put in place and the needs identified. Therefore, it's removed that risk for that child to be permanently excluded. I mean, no child should be permanently excluded for an unmet need. I mean, if there is, it needs to be in for a disciplinary reason. And as frustrating as it is for schools, if we see that is the case, we certainly will challenge or signpost or push them for to access some of those additional needs that they may need. I mean, yes, there's going to be cases where CAMS waiting lists and stuff, but I think it would be very, very rare for a school, and I've certainly not seen it for a while, where schools are excluding for those kind of around those kind of kids having access to waiting lists or not being picked up by children's social care. Like I say, more in reality, it's more to do maybe where there has been specific SEN needs, and therefore we are able to provide some support in other areas. I hope that answers your question.
In part, but I think there's just a few question marks, I suppose, around what's been shared, just in the context of the piece of work that we did around this. And I think probably what comes to mind for Councillor Gordon, as does for me, is some focus groups that we held, in particular for me with Turkish-speaking parents. We spoke to a lot of families whose children had special educational needs, who were excluded from school, and you know, arguably one could say that quite a significant proportion of children with special educational needs may well have been excluded due to unmet needs, in terms of if we did have, didn't have finite resources to be able to meet the needs of children, who knows whether they would have been supported to be able to remain in education. But I do distinctly remember hearing a parent say that their child's education healthcare plan was out of date by quite a number of years. And in fact, I think it was that it hadn't been updated since primary school and they were in secondary school. So that's a sort of example, I think, of perhaps even what Councillor Selman was talking about, in terms of, are we able to hold a mirror up to ourselves when exclusions, when we get to the point of exclusion, to be able to say, well, actually, had this young person's education healthcare plan been updated in a secondary context, who knows whether the transgression that resulted in their exclusion may have happened or not? We don't know. And the reality is, another thing that's worth pointing out is that same parent group were explaining that culturally, they don't challenge authority. people in positions of authority and are unlikely to challenge school exclusions, is what a particular parent said to us. So I imagine the instances where a panel, independent review panel is convened, where you've got robust representation from a parent, in some situations just isn't going to happen. So I think the confidence about sort of these being overturned, it just didn't feel like that's what we were hearing from parents, and quite frankly, actually also the alternative provision, who was saying to us that these children have got really quite acute needs here, that they've come to us, and so I feel like there's maybe something that we might want to look at there, because I think that even if the parents don't represent themselves in those meetings, are we still represented as a local authority? Are we confident that we're making that argument on behalf of those children if their parents aren't able to, in those sorts of situations?
I mean, if there's been sorry, I was coming. I mean, if somebody used to attend the hearings and manages those that now attend them, if there's a significant breach of policy, or that there has been a breach, that's certainly something that we would highlight to the panel. I mean, we may not necessarily give particular our views on the particular merits of an exclusion, but we will certainly highlight to guide the specific points of guidance and reference, for example, external guidance, for example, the EHC, the Equalities Act and stuff like that, whether or not there has been any breaches there, or reference to specific to governors to consider specific points of the Equality Act that may be relevant to a particular case. Now, I mean, that's the level of our influence at that point. We can guide them to it, and we can kind of guide them to specific points. We can't make them consider it and actually kind of reach the conclusion that we may want. But certainly then, if that has happened, we have officers that then would reach out to parents and try and almost encourage them to make better use of advocacy support services, or contact some of those support services directly ourselves and suggest that they maybe have a conversation with a parent who may not be able to reach out to them. So maybe could the organisation reach out to the parent just to have a chat? And I've seen where that's worked quite well in the past as well.
Thank you very much. I think we're probably going to bring this to a close. There are a couple of other questions that I really did want to ask, but I think instead I might follow up with, because I know that we've got the responses to each of the individual recommendations, but I think that there are some that could be fleshed out just a little bit more. For example, the one around safeguarding and the safeguarding risk assessments. The recommendation was around these being independent, multidisciplinary, and it sounds as though perhaps it's still within it's the schools that are doing these safeguarding risk assessments. So just to get some clarity on that point, for example, and also any additional work that we've done to sort of bring our alternative provision into the wider family of Hackney schools, it would be interesting for us to hear a bit more about that, especially as it relates to sort of information sharing, as was detailed quite a bit in the report. Really sorry for having gone over, but thank you very much for everybody who took part in that item, and for your report and for your continued efforts around this. I can clearly see the efforts that have gone into this, and it's really encouraging to see the amount of weight that's being put behind a piece of work that it took the Commission, quite a number of years to do, and it involved a strong voice from the community, children, young people and their parents, and it's really reassuring to see the commitment behind it. So thank you very much. So last couple of items which we should hopefully be able to get through quite quickly. Item 7, the free school meals, childhood food poverty item. In relation to growing levels of childhood poverty and the ongoing cost of living crisis, the Commission undertook a number of site visits to local primary and secondary schools to assess what could be done to develop and extend free school meal provision, and how schools were working to address childhood food poverty in general. The Commission heard evidence from a number of local head teachers and questioned local officers at its meeting in October 2022, and has produced a short summary of its findings from this work. It is hoped that these findings will inform the work of the Childhood Food Poverty Task Force established by the Deputy Mayor and Cabinet Member for Education, Young People and Children's Social Care. Do members note this? Thank you very much. Moving on to item 9, the work programme. The updated work programme for the remainder of 2022-23 is contained within the report pack at page 291. Martin, did you want to share anything about?
Quickly just run through the key points.
Yep.
Sorry, just quickly, I won't keep everyone too much. So the main things that which we'll have now is the child cues follow-up scrutiny. It's happening on the 28th of March. Stakeholder, we're just working out the objectives for the session and our agenda with chairs for the respective commissions. And we'll be sending out the official invites very shortly for that. So that's on the evening of the 28th of March. Next meeting, we've got the Cabinet Q&A for Councillor Woodley, and we've agreed on 3 items there. That's on get the update on the children's centres, support for children, support for parents of children with SEND, and demand waiting times for specialist services for children with SEND. That's around educational psychology and speech and language therapy, to get that update and where the plan is to reduce some of those waiting times. Just as some other dates kind of coming forward as well, we've got in our March meeting, we've got support for young parents. There is, the officers are preparing a Hackney-wide kind of response paper for us, setting out how services are working together to support young parents. That encompasses public health, our children's centres, Young Hackney, children and families. So there'll be a very detailed, comprehensive plan paper being presented for that. But ahead of the meeting, we are going to set up a number of focus groups to speak to 2 groups of young parents. So there'll be our care leaver kind of population, our cohort, but also with our kind of more acute needs with children, our parents support through our family nurse partnership as well, who have more kind of more vulnerabilities around that as well. So kind of capture that ahead of the meeting. Final bit here is around April meetings around CAMS. Again, ahead of that meeting, we have set up a focus group with our CAMS providers, so members can speak to those providers firsthand ahead of that meeting to understand what the accessibility issues are, what the waiting times are, and what services are doing to support those young people while they're waiting to be seen. That's the critical things that we wanted to be looking at. So dates for that is the 22nd of March, roughly. We've got printed at the moment with the providers, and the support for young parents. That's going to happen probably in the first week of March. We'll be working with Hackney tomorrow and our family nurse partnership to see if we can do that. Okay, thanks, sorry.
Thank you very much, Martin. Item 10, the minutes. The minutes of the meetings held on the 30th of November are attached for members to note and approve. Members note and approve the minutes.
Agreed.
Thank you. There is one action arising from the minutes, which was a request for further information on the distance from Hackney for those children placed in residential settings. The response is contained in the agenda pack at page 305. Item 11, any other business? Do you have other business?
During the pre-meeting, and we ran out of time. So it was 2 things. One was just, first of all, on the exclusions review, if we've given any further thought to providing like an accessible version for broader communication, given the level of interest across the borough on it. And then the other thing is, so my understanding is that Living and Hackney have a session next week on policing drug use, which, as I recall, is something that was also one of the topics that came out of Child Q, the joint session, which for obvious reason sits squarely with Living in Hackney. But it was just a quick question as to whether we were planning on feeding into that at all as a scrutiny commission, or having any link into it in terms of the perspective of that, in terms of the impact on young people and policing of drug use, or if we'll just see how. Yeah, I'm not saying necessarily should. I was just asking if we were planning on, because I know it's obviously something that stemmed out of that, and it's come up in other sort of sessions stuff indirectly.
Very much. I think we'll have to give that some food for thought. I'm sure that there's something that we must be able to do in relation to it. It feels like it's something that would fit, but that we haven't really given thought to. But it sort of resurfaces another sort of challenge around where the youth offending team and work around the youth offending team sort of sits with us when a lot of, well, policing sits firmly in another scrutiny commission's remit. But yes, let's give some thought to that outside of this meeting and see if we're able to add some value to that. Thank you very much. The next meeting is on the 27th of February, 2023. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Bye-bye.
Thank you.